Hello and welcome to Crime Scene Investigation and Reconstruction, Chapter 1, Introduction to Physical Evidence. Types of evidence. Evidence can be direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, testimonial evidence, or physical evidence. Direct evidence. Direct evidence is evidence that proves a fact without the necessity of an inference or a presumption that, when true, conclusively establishes that fact. An example is testimony by a completely credible witness that proves the fact stated in the testimony. Circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence involves a series of facts that, although not the fact at issue, tends through inference to prove a fact at issue. This type of evidence is usually a chain of circumstances from which a fair assumption can be made as to the validity of the fact at issue. Testimonial evidence. Testimonial evidence is evidence given by lay or expert witnesses. The principal test for this type of evidence is the credibility of the witness. The trier of fact, judge or jury, in a court proceeding determines the credibility of the witness and thus the believability of the testimony given by the witness. This point cannot be overstated, since the testimony of a witness who is not credible can be, and often is, ignored by the trier of fact. This reality of testimony is the principal reason that law enforcement officers and expert witnesses must be diligent in establishing their credibility. Physical evidence. Physical evidence consists of physical objects that are linked to the commission of a crime or tort. Virtually any type of physical object can become physical evidence in a criminal investigation. In this chapter, the major types of physical evidence encountered in criminal investigations are listed, but the investigator needs to remain alert to the possibility that physical objects not mentioned in this text or other texts relating to physical evidence may become valuable evidence in an investigation. Value of physical evidence. Physical evidence can be defined as physical objects associated with a crime or a tort. Analysis and interpretation of the physical evidence may assist in the investigation of a crime or tort in a number of ways. However, in order to be of any value, it is critical that the physical evidence be recognized as potential evidence, collected in an appropriate manner, and preserved properly for transmittal to the laboratory. Failure to recognize, collect, or preserve the physical evidence may compromise or destroy the evidence, thereby impeding the investigation. In the worst-case scenario, the failure to preserve crucial evidence may lead to the erroneous conviction of an innocent party or the inability to convict a guilty party. The failure to collect the evidence may also hinder a subsequent civil action on behalf of an injured party. Physical evidence may play a crucial role in many criminal investigations. The primary roles of physical evidence in the investigation of crimes include those that follow. Reconstruction of the crime scene. Reconstruction of the crime scene is one of the major purposes for the collection of physical evidence. This procedure may involve the reconstruction of a single event, such as determination of muzzle-to-target distance in a shooting, or it may involve the determination of the sequence of a series of events, such as the interpretation of bloodstain patterns at a crime scene. Reconstruction of the crime scene frequently allows the investigator to determine the accuracy of statements from witnesses. The statement of a witness may be corroborated by a reconstruction of the crime scene, or the statement of the witness may be shown to be false. Example: in a prison homicide case, several witnesses to the crime came forward and offered to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. The statements of each of the witnesses were proven to be false by reconstruction of the crime by using bloodstain pattern interpretation, coupled with the laboratory typing results for the bloodstains. Each witness placed the two stabbing victims in areas where they could not have been during the assault. One witness indicated that the assaults took place at one end of the tier where no bloodstains were located. The bloodstain patterns proved that the assault occurred at the opposite end of the tier. Determine whether or not a crime occurred. The physical evidence may also establish whether or not a crime occurred. For example, reconstruction of a shooting event can help establish whether the shooting was an accident, suicide, or homicide. Example: in a suspected homicide, a wife stated that while sitting downstairs reading, she heard a gunshot upstairs, ran upstairs to the bedroom, and found her husband in bed with a gunshot wound to the head. She indicated that with one hand she picked up the revolver next to her husband's head, transferred it to the other hand, placed it on the nightstand, and then called the police. Tests for gunshot residue on her husband's hands revealed a high level of GSR on the back of the husband's right hand, but no residues on either palm or the back of the left hand. GSR tests on the wife's hands revealed medium levels of gunshot residue on each palm, but no residues on the back of either hand. Experimental testing that duplicated the conditions as stated by the wife revealed GSR levels that were virtually the same as those found on the wife's hands and the hands of the deceased husband, confirming the statement of the wife and thus verifying that the death was a suicide. Link an individual with another individual or with a crime scene. Many types of evidence may be used to associate an individual with another individual or place. These types of evidence are commonly referred to as linkage, associative, or transfer evidence. That is, the evidence may tend to show a contact between individuals that resulted in a transfer of evidence. For example, hairs and fibers, bloodstains, between the individuals involved, or a transfer of materials from an individual to a crime scene, or vice versa, referred to as a linkage triangle. This process is frequently referred to as the Locard exchange principle, after the Frenchman Locard, who stated that contact between individuals results in an exchange of materials between the two individuals. Virtually every type of physical evidence may fall into this category, since any object left at the crime scene may link the perpetrator to the crime scene or to the victim, and any object transferred from the victim or the scene to the perpetrator links the perpetrator to the crime. The transfer of physical materials from the victim to the perpetrator and vice versa may establish contact between the two, and thus provide factual material for a reconstruction effort. The linkage triangle illustrates the exchange routes for transfer evidence between victim and perpetrator, between the crime scene and the victim, and between the crime scene and the perpetrator. Provide investigative leads to investigators. An important function of the crime scene investigator is to provide investigative leads to the detectives and other investigators charged with the responsibility of investigating the crime. For example, the finding of a specific hair type in a homicide may provide information about the hair color and racial group of the assailant. In one case known to the author, the racial characteristics of a single hair led to the rapid arrest of a suspect in a robbery homicide. Without this crucial investigative information, none of the additional critical evidence, currency-bearing bloodstains from the victim in the possession of the perpetrator, would have been retrieved. Often, the initial examinations of physical evidence from the crime scene, although not conclusive evidence, may provide sufficient leads to the investigators such that the follow-up investigation will uncover conclusive evidence as to the identity of the perpetrator. Provide facts to a jury that may assist in the determination of the guilt or innocence of an accused person. Frequently, in homicide and sexual assault cases, the analysis of physical evidence provides evidence of the guilt or innocence of an accused person. In one of the author's cases, the analysis of hair, semen typing, and latent fingerprint identifications led to the exoneration of an accused and the identification of the true rapist in a serial rapist case. The analysis of semen eliminated the accused person in 3 victims' cases, while hair analysis eliminated the accused in 2 of the cases. It was the identification of the latent fingerprint evidence in one of the victims' cases through an automated fingerprint system that ultimately identified the true rapist. Provide evidence to link serial homicide or rape cases. In serial homicide or serial rape investigations, the physical evidence is often the strongest link between the series of crimes and the perpetrator. In homicides, firearms evidence and trace evidence often provide the link between the crimes and the perpetrator, as in the Wayne Williams case, in which fibers provided the link between the victims and the suspect. In serial rape cases, both trace evidence and semen typing, particularly DNA typing, may link the perpetrator to each of the crimes. Some advantages of physical evidence. Physical evidence has a number of advantages over testimonial evidence because of the tangible nature of this type of evidence. These advantages include those that follow. Physical evidence provides a tangible object for the jury to see. Unlike testimonial evidence, the physical evidence can be seen by the jury, and thus provides the added impact of the visual senses on the jury. The physical evidence can be taken into the jury room. The impact of the physical evidence is carried into the jury room with the evidence, and therefore continues its argument in the jury deliberations. The defendant cannot distort the physical evidence. The physical evidence speaks for itself and cannot be misrepresented by the defendant. Often, the physical evidence will effectively rebut statements by the defendant, and in some cases will prove that the defendant's statements are false. Some cases cannot be solved without the physical evidence. In many crimes, the case is solved by the physical evidence that has been collected and analyzed in the case. Some cases may be solved by a single latent print collected at the scene. This outcome has been especially true since the introduction of the automated latent fingerprint identification systems, which allow the latent fingerprint examiner to search a very large database for a match to the latent print. Physical evidence is not subject to memory loss. One of the shortcomings of witnesses' testimony is the inevitable memory loss that occurs over time. The sometimes lengthy delays experienced before a case comes to trial may have a deleterious effect on the witness's memory, and thus weaken the impact of their testimony. The proper collection and analysis of the physical evidence results in a permanent record that is immune to memory loss. The defendant can have the evidence tested by an independent expert of the defendant's choosing. One of the factors that adds to the credibility of physical evidence is the defendant's ability to have the evidence examined by an outside expert. It is rare for the defendant's expert to contradict the opinions of the prosecution's expert. Major categories of physical evidence. Physical evidence can be categorized in several different ways. The evidence can be classified according to the physical nature of the evidence, for example, blood, latent prints, firearms evidence, etc., by the types of examinations performed on the evidence, for example, microscopic, macroscopic, or instrumental, or by the branch of examiners who perform the examinations on the evidence, for example, forensic chemist, document examiner, firearms examiner, etc. The classification of evidence varies from one geographical area to another, but the majority of jurisdictions classify physical evidence according to the following outline: fingerprints, friction ridge evidence; firearms evidence, firearms, discharge residues, fired components; biological evidence, blood, semen, and other types; trace, microscopic transfer evidence; document evidence, questioned handwriting, typewriting, papers, inks, etc.; physical matching evidence, matching of items that have been broken apart; toxicology evidence, drugs, poisons in body fluids and tissues; drug evidence, and other types, various evidence types not included in the preceding listing. It is not unusual for the investigator to utilize many different types of evidence in order to investigate successfully a major criminal case. It may be necessary to use witness testimony, criminal profiling and victimology, physical evidence and suspect interrogation, and polygraph testing to solve a given case. It is the blending of these investigative approaches that provides both a challenge to the modern investigator and the ability to solve crimes that might otherwise go unsolved. Class and individual characteristics of physical evidence. The concepts of class and individual characteristics must be understood by the crime scene investigator in order to interpret reports from the crime laboratory. Class characteristics are those characteristics shared by all members of a class. Since class characteristics are shared by all members of a class, those types of physical evidence having only class characteristics cannot be identified to a single source. These types of evidence are referred to as class-only types of evidence. For example, the fibers from a garment would have only class characteristics, since the fibers used to produce the garment are produced in very large quantities, as are the dyes used to dye the fibers. Human hair is another example of an evidence type with class characteristics only. The characteristics in human hair that are used for comparison are under genetic control, and thus are shared by large segments in some populations, hairs from Asian populations, for example. Whereas in other populations, the hair characteristics are shared by much smaller populations, reddish blonde hair in Caucasian populations, for example. When the hair from a crime scene matches the hair from an individual, the examiner may state that the evidence hair may have come from that individual, since other individuals in the population under consideration may also have hair that matches the evidence hair. Class-only types of evidence may, however, be used conclusively to eliminate a suspected source. Reddish blonde hair, for example, could not have come from a specific Asian individual having only black hair. Identity is defined as the collective aspect of the set of characteristics by which a thing is definitively recognizable or known. This set of characteristics, or pattern, includes all the class characteristics of the class to which the object belongs and, additionally, those individual characteristics that serve to set the object apart from all other objects in its class. Thus, the pattern of class and individual characteristics establishes the individuality of a specific object. This pattern of class and individual characteristics of an object, when unique to only one member of a class, allows for the identification of the individual source of the evidence item, a process called individualization. The questioned item is individualized when the examiner is able to match the set of class and individual characteristics found in the questioned item to the same set of characteristics in the known sample, or its exemplar. In many cases, the set of class and individual characteristics of an object are transferred to an evidence item. For example, the class and individual characteristics of a firearm's barrel interior are transferred to the surface of bullets fired in the weapon. The characteristics on the bullet are used to identify the weapon through comparison of these characteristics with those on a bullet known to have been fired in the suspect weapon, rather than attempting to compare the characteristics within the barrel directly with the characteristics on a bullet suspected of being fired in that weapon. Those types of evidence that have individual characteristics can be identified to a single source, that is, can be individualized. Latent fingerprints are an example of a physical evidence type that can be individualized. Although each characteristic, minutia, used to identify the source of the latent print is a class characteristic, the combination of the occurrence and the spatial relationships of the minutia are considered to establish a unique pattern for a given area of friction-ridged skin, thus allowing for the individualization of the latent print. Note, the terms identification and individualization are sometimes used interchangeably for certain types of evidence, such as fingerprints and firearms. See Table 1.1 for examples of those types of evidence considered to have class-only characteristics, or those with individual characteristics that allow the examiner to identify the individual source of the evidence item. Another type of evidence with individual characteristics consists of physical matching evidence. When an object is torn or broken apart, the fracture edges can often be matched by placing the parts together jigsaw puzzle style to illustrate the matching of the fractured or torn edges. Examples of these types of evidence include paint or glass fragments, adhesive tapes used as bindings, and broken pry bars. Note, some of the evidence types with class-only characteristics may still be individualized through other means. Hair that has been pulled from a scalp may have the fleshy portion of the hair root adhering, the root sheath, and may be analyzed for DNA type, and thus that hair may be individualized, although the DNA is technically a product of the scalp tissue rather than the hair itself. If there is no scalp tissue adhering to the root, the hair may still be analyzed for mitochondrial DNA. Other types, such as soil, may have a particular set of class characteristics in which the set of characteristics is so rare as to verge on being unique, and thus be thought of as individual. In some drug seizures, the particular combination of the diluents used and the byproducts of manufacture may constitute a pattern that allows the analyst to link the drug seizure to the larger source with varying degrees of confidence. Also, the class characteristics of a given item of evidence allow the examiner rapidly to screen suspected sources for the evidence item. If the class characteristics of the suspected source do not match those of the questioned item, then that suspected source is eliminated from further consideration by the analyst. In some cases, a specific item of physical evidence in the individual characteristics column may have an insufficient number of the individual characteristics present to allow for a positive identification. Smudged latent fingerprints or damaged bullets, for example. The analyst will usually note the lack of sufficient detail in the evidence item in the laboratory report. For example, the fingerprint examiner may state that the latent print recovered from a crime scene lacks sufficient individual detail to allow for a positive identification. In this case, the examiner is indicating that there are insufficient individual details, points of comparison, in the latent print to allow for an unqualified opinion as to the source of the latent print. The classification of the various evidence types into class-only and individual characteristics types is a simplification of the classification schemes for the different classes of evidence. The universe of physical evidence can be classified in a hierarchical scheme for all the evidence types. but at the present time, little work has been done to provide a comprehensive classification scheme for all physical evidence. Classification efforts heretofore have been limited to attempts by specialists in certain types of evidence, such as firearms evidence. Table 1-2 gives examples of some of the classification levels of firearms evidence. These classification levels and sublevels are generally of interest only to researchers in their respective specialties and have little effect on the investigator's understanding of class and individual characteristics. They are presented here only to acquaint the investigator with the terms that may be encountered in the literature of forensic science. Table 1-3 lists some class and individual characteristics for some of the other types of physical evidence commonly encountered in crime scene investigations that have individual characteristics in addition to their class characteristics. Note, individual characteristics for DNA patterns are based on statistical analysis of the patterns found in the evidence sample rather than on the aggregate experience of forensic serologists. Laboratory analysis of physical evidence. The usual purpose of the laboratory analysis is to individualize the physical evidence. Individualization is defined as the identification of the individual source of the evidence item. This process usually involves the comparison of the question source item to a known item, an item from a known source. Figure 1-2 illustrates the comparison process utilized by all examiners of physical evidence, regardless of the evidence type. The questioned item in the comparison is usually an item collected at a crime scene, from the victim or from the suspect. The known item is an item of known source, or an exemplar prepared from the known item. See Table 1-4, which follows, for examples of questioned and known items. Results of the comparison process. The comparison may reveal one of the following observations. 1. The questioned item matches the exemplar. 2. The questioned item has some similarities to the exemplar. 3. The questioned item has no similarity to the exemplar. When the examiner states that the questioned item matches the exemplar item, the examiner is indicating that all the class characteristics of both the exemplar and the questioned items are the same, and that the similarities in the individual characteristics, in the case of an evidence type having individual characteristics, of the questioned and exemplar outweigh any dissimilarities noted by the examiner between the two. There is no such thing as a perfect match. Opinions derived from the comparisons. When the questioned item and the exemplar match, the examiner may state either of the following opinions. The questioned item came from the same source as the exemplar, individualization. This opinion is based on the observation that all the class characteristics in the questioned and the exemplar items are the same, and that the agreement in the individual characteristics between the two is sufficient to establish that the two must have originated from the same source. Or, the questioned item may have come from the same source as the exemplar. If the evidence type is one that has only class characteristics, this opinion constitutes an identification of the evidence item's class, that is, that the evidence item has the same class characteristics as the exemplar item. See Table 1-1. If the evidence item is one that has individual characteristics, the examiner is indicating that the agreement noted between the questioned and known items is insufficient to establish, in the opinion of the examiner, that the two have the same source. Or, if they do not match, the examiner may state either of the following. The questioned item may or may not have come from the same source as the exemplar. Inconclusive. As a rule, this opinion indicates that either the questioned item or the exemplar item lacks sufficient quality for a definitive opinion, or that damage or alteration to the questioned item prevents an adequate comparison. Usually, the examiner will indicate that more standards are needed if the submitted standard sample is inadequate for the comparison. Or, the questioned item did not come from the same source as the exemplar. Elimination. This opinion eliminates the known item as the source of the questioned item. Table 1-4 gives some examples of the types of evidence items involved in comparison analyses and their components. Comparison standards and controls. Since most laboratory analyses involve a comparison of the questioned item with known items, the quality of the laboratory analysis depends heavily on the collection and submission of the proper standards and controls for each item submitted. The term questioned item refers to an item with an unknown source. Other terms used to characterize the questioned item include unknown, evidence, crime sample, latent, if we're talking about fingerprints, and additional terms from various specialists. All of these terms refer to an item with an unknown source that is to be compared with an item from a known source in order to establish whether or not the questioned and known samples share the same source. Knowns, both the original sample and the derived exemplar samples, are frequently referred to by the capital letter K, and the questioned or evidence item is referred to as the Q sample. Knowns consist of two categories, standards and exemplars. Standards consist of materials from a known source and can be either a comparison standard or a reference standard. Comparison standards are those materials collected from a known source for comparison with a questioned sample, in order to determine whether the questioned sample came from the same source as the comparison standard. An example of a comparison standard is a blood sample from a known individual that is used to compare its blood types against an evidence blood stains types. The blood standards are usually obtained from the principals in a particular case, such as the victims and the suspects. Other examples of comparison standards are the inked fingerprints from a known individual to compare with latent fingerprints from a crime scene, a hair sample from a suspect to compare with hairs found at a crime scene, fiber samples from a carpet at a crime scene to compare with fibers found on a suspect's shoes, and a firearm seized from a suspect to compare with bullets retrieved from a victim in a shooting. Items derived from these standards for use in the laboratory comparison with the questioned items are referred to as exemplar items. Reference standards are specimens kept in a reference collection by the various laboratories. These standards consist of specimens that have been collected from different sources and that have been authenticated as to the source and composition. These reference standards are used to verify the type and composition of known samples obtained in casework. Examples of reference standards are paint collections obtained from manufacturers, hair collections obtained from specific body sites from individuals of known racial composition, drug standards from manufacturers, and blood samples obtained from individuals of known blood types. Exemplar is the term used to describe either a sample of the comparison standard, known, that is collected or prepared from the comparison standard for the purposes of comparison with the questioned item, or the entire comparison standard used for the comparison with the questioned item. The exemplar item must be a true representation of the known sample in order to be useful in the comparison process. The exemplar utilized should contain both the class and the individual characteristics, if the evidence type is one with individual characteristics, of the known. It is important for the crime scene investigator to consider the variations present in any standards collected for the laboratory analysis, making sure that the standards collected represent the variations present in the known. For example, a carpet fiber sample should contain all the colors in the carpet being sampled. Note, different specialties may refer to exemplar items by other terms. Inked print by the fingerprint examiner, test-fired bullet by the firearms examiner, and so forth. Controls are those items tested simultaneously with the questioned item to reveal any problems associated with the integrity of the evidence item or the testing procedure. Controls consist of the standards mentioned before and those items that will show the effects of background on the questioned item, background controls. Background effects may be the result of an interaction between the questioned item and the material on which the questioned item is found. For example, a bloodstain on a garment may be damaged by a chemical agent already on the garment. A control, unstained portion of the garment near the site of the bloodstain is tested simultaneously with the stained area. Any problem associated with a chemical on the garment would then be apparent in the analysis results for the control. The known standard specimen and the background controls are subjected to the same tests as the evidence bloodstain in order to determine that the blood typing technique being employed gives the correct answer for the blood types being tested for by the analyst. If the standards or controls tested give the wrong result in the testing procedure, the analyst knows that there is some error in the testing system, and so must troubleshoot the system before repeating the analysis. Control specimens must be collected for most biological stains, such as blood stains, semen stains, and saliva stains, as interference from the background is always a consideration for the testing of these types of evidence. Blood or semen stains collected from a surface must always be accompanied by a control sample collected from the same surface as near to the stain as feasible, but yet sufficiently far away to assure that the control specimen is not contaminated with the stain. Specific information for each type of physical evidence with regard to its proper collection procedures, storage requirements, and the types of standards and controls needed for the laboratory analysis will be presented in the chapter for that type of evidence. If any question exists about the collection of standards or controls needed, the crime scene investigator should contact the laboratory that will analyze that particular evidence for detailed instructions on the preferred method of collection and on the standards and controls needed for that laboratory. Legal and scientific requirements for evidence collection. In order to be utilized effectively and to be admissible in a court of law, evidence collected must meet both the legal requirements and the scientific requirements for evidence collection. If an item of evidence is collected legally, but is not collected in a manner that satisfies a scientific requirement necessary for preserving the integrity of the evidence for examination purposes, the laboratory may not be able to perform meaningful examinations on the evidence. Conversely, if the evidence collection meets all the scientific requirements for its collection, but cannot pass a legal test for its admissibility, the evidence may be excluded in court. Search and seizure laws. The first rule to be met in the processing of a crime scene is that the search and seizure of physical evidence must meet all the legal requirements for the seizure of the evidence. In some instances, a search warrant must be obtained before evidence can be seized at a crime scene. In other instances, the evidence may be seized without waiting for a search warrant. It is imperative that the crime scene team be certain of the legality of evidence seizure prior to processing the scene. For this reason, it is necessary to obtain guidelines from the prosecutor's office regarding the rules of search and seizure for the appropriate jurisdiction. Evidence seized without proper legal authority may be ruled inadmissible, thus causing the efforts of the crime scene investigation to be ineffective. Therefore, it is very helpful to have a prosecuting attorney as a member of the investigative team in major crimes, especially homicides. Documentation of the scene. The second legal requirement for any crime scene investigation is to provide proper documentation of the crime scene and the collection of evidence. Although each crime scene has a number of unique features that sets it apart from all others, there are a number of requirements for each scene that must be met in order to document properly the condition of the scene and the actions taken to process the scene. Proper documentation of the scene involves adequate notes, photographs, and sketches necessary to recreate the crime scene in the mind's eye of the investigators, attorneys, and the judge and jury in any judicial proceeding. Notes may be handwritten or dictated into a handheld tape recorder or a combination of both. Photography may be accomplished with still cameras, digital cameras, videotape recorders, or a combination of these. See the chapter on photography for a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of still and video photography. It is important that the scene be documented in the condition in which it was found, rather than attempt to replace any items that have been moved prior to arrival at the scene. The documentation should be an ongoing process, involving taking notes, preparing sketches, and taking photographs as the investigation proceeds. This approach gives coherence to the crime scene search and avoids having to go back and fill in gaps. Identification of physical evidence collected. The third legal requirement for evidence collection is that each item of evidence collected must be properly identified with sufficient information to ensure that the item can be identified by the collector at any time in the future. The item or its sealed package should have the following minimum information affixed to the item or its package, referred to throughout this text as standard identification data. Case number for investigator's agency, date, time of a collection, item number, this may be augmented with the collector's badge or ID number, initials of the collector or personalized logo. Note, it is best to print the collector's last name, then to add the initials or logo. When these conditions for collection and identification of the item are met, the collector will be able to identify unambiguously the item as that same item collected by the investigator. These precautions will help immeasurably to establish the credibility of the collector's report or testimony and will effectively avoid any suggestion that the item has been misidentified. Oftentimes, judicial proceedings are had long after the processing at a scene, during which time the crime scene investigator will have processed many additional scenes having similar evidence. The proper documentation of the evidence at the time it is collected will prevent confusion of the evidence item with any other collected by the crime scene investigator during the time span between collection and testimony regarding the specific item. Chain of possession or chain of custody. Another essential legal requirement for the introduction of physical evidence in the courtroom is that the item must be identified as the same item collected at the scene, and further that the item has not been altered in any significant fashion. Usually, the handling and analysis of the evidence will produce some alteration of the evidence or its packaging. For this reason, it is essential that the chain of possession be established and maintained so that any apparent or real alteration of the evidence can be explained by the person who effected the change. This person can testify as to how the alterations were necessitated, by the laboratory analysis, for example. The collector's notes and report should reflect to whom and when the evidence was relinquished, as well as the general nature and condition of the evidence relinquished. For example, expended cartridge case in sealed manila envelope. It is also important to establish that the evidence remains in a secure environment so that any personnel with potential access to the evidence can be identified in order to eliminate any suggestion of tampering or of any other artifice that may be used in an attempt to exclude the evidence on legal grounds. Properly maintained evidence rooms meet this requirement, whereas storage in personal lockers or desks may be suspect as to the integrity of the chain of possession. Scientific requirements. Of equal importance to the legal requirements are the scientific requirements for evidence collection, which also must be satisfied in order for the evidence to be admissible in the courts. The scientific requirements for evidence collection are essential parameters that ensure the scientific integrity of the physical evidence collected, and include those that follow. Preventing contamination of the evidence. Prevention of contamination of the evidence requires proper protection of the evidence at the scene prior to its collection. Prevention measures include limiting access to the scene to only those individuals of the investigative team with a legitimate need to enter the scene, preventing casual inspection of evidence at the scene, protection from inclement weather, and the proper packaging of the evidence. The observance of these measures will help to ensure the scientific integrity of the physical evidence recovered from the scene. Preserving the condition of the evidence as found. Preserving the condition of the evidence as found is accomplished by using proper collection and packaging techniques for that particular type of evidence, and further, ensuring that the evidence is properly stored until its transmittal to the laboratory. Items requiring refrigeration or freezing during storage should be clearly marked on the outside of the package to indicate the type of storage required, so that the property officer can take the appropriate actions for preserving the evidence. Collection of adequate comparison standards. The comparison standards collected should be adequate and appropriate for the anticipated laboratory examinations. The quality and integrity of the laboratory examinations depend heavily on the quality of the comparison standards collected by the investigator. The standards must be of adequate size and quantity and must be an accurate representation of the source of the standards. Now try going through these review questions. See if you can fill in the blanks. Feel free to go back and look at the text for inspiration or just to jog your memory. Good luck!